Hello everyone, it's Scott and we're back with more day one previews. Today in this video we're going to look at the commons and uncommons that were previewed on the first official day of Aetherdrift spoilers. I've done already a video for the rares and for the mythic rares from the set, so you can take a look at those. I'll leave links at the end of the video for you. But before we dive into these commons and uncommons, remember to like and subscribe to get further content like this throughout Aetherdrift spoiler season and beyond. So let's dive into today's previews. So I want to start with the lands that we got today. So we got a cycle of roads, and each of them, if you have a mount or a vehicle in play, enters untapped. If you don't, then it is something that's going to enter tapped. So that's a downside to these lands. But as long as you're playing a mount or a vehicle deck, I think these are perfectly good cards to have in your mana base, because they give you a mana of the specific color, and in addition to that you can pay one and a red or a black or whatever the color of the land is, and then you can sacrifice it to create a 1/1 colorless pilot creature token. With this token saddles mounts and cruise vehicles as though its power were 2 greater, activate only as a sorcery. So I think that ability is good enough for these to see standard play if you're using mounts and vehicles. Next, we've got some additional lands from today. The first is Night Market. And this is a land that enters tapped, and as it enters you get to choose a color, and then you can add 1 mana of the chosen color with no downside. Most of the time we're seeing this recently, you lose a life every time you tap it for mana. So this is a nice upgrade from those cards. And you can cycle it also for 3 mana. And I think because of that, I think this is a card that can easily go into a variety of mana bases. Next, we've got Amonkhet Raceway. Again, it has the start your engine mechanic, where if you have no speed, it starts at 1. It increases once on each of your turns when an opponent loses life, and the max speed is 4. So it taps for colorless mana, but once you get to max speed, then target creature gains haste until end of turn when you tap Amonkhet Raceway, which I think makes this playable in standard. Basically, you will have a land that taps to give a creature haste, which is a really strong ability in standard and in a lot of formats generally. Next, we've got Avishkar Raceway. Again, it's got the start your engine mechanic, and it adds a colorless mana, and its max speed ability is pay 3 mana and discard a card and draw a card. So in terms of the rate for doing that, it's not as good as some of the other cards we've seen so far, but having it on a land is actually pretty nice because it's a repeatable thing that you can do as many times as you need to over the course of a game. Next, we've got our white cards for the day, and the first is Air Response Unit for 2 and a white mana. You get an artifact vehicle, that's a 3/3 with flying and vigilance, and it simply crews for 1. Nice generic vehicle with a low crewing cost, so I can see this having standard playability because it does have vigilance, so you can block with it or you can attack with it, and we do have a lot of small 2 power or less flying creatures right now that are seeing a lot of play in standard, so this would be a really nice block for those to prevent those things from attacking you, and also giving you then the ability to attack through them when needed. Next, we've got Light Shield Parry for a white mana. You get an instant, and target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn, and you can cycle it for 2 mana. Good card here. It leads me to think that possibly we could see the Leyline of Resonance deck move from red and green possibly into red and white, simply because we've got a number of cantrips like this now that I think makes having it in white something that's at least a consideration as we move forward. Next, we've got Hull Drifter for 3 and 2 blue mana. You get an artifact vehicle, that's a 3/2 with flying, And when this vehicle enters, you get to draw 2 cards and it crews for 3. So this is a Mole Drifter, but on a vehicle. Mole Drifter was a card that, same cost, gave you 2 cards when you cast it. So we're seeing the same thing, simply on a vehicle this time. So it's not as good because you have to crew this, but certainly a card that has seen play in the past. Next, we've got Midnight Mangler for 1 and a blue mana. You get an artifact vehicle. That's a 3/3. And during turns other than yours, this vehicle is an artifact creature, and it crews for 2. So I really like this one. Basically on defense, you get a 3/3 for 2 mana, which in blue is above rate. And the crew cost of 2, if you want to attack with it, isn't a problem because you've got those things in your deck already in blue. So I think this has a chance of seeing some standard play. Next, we've got Streaking Oil Gorger for 4 and a black mana. You get a vampire. That's 3/3 with flying and haste, and it has start your engine. And if you reach the start your engine requirement, your max speed, then this creature gets lifelink. Nothing more than a card that we'll see in limited. Next, we've got Prowlcatcher Specialist for 1 and a red mana. You get a Goblin Warrior. That's a 2/1 with haste. And it has Exhaust for 3 and a red mana, where you get to put 2 +1/+1 counters on this creature. So we've seen creatures like this in the past, but the fact that it has haste, I think, gives it some playability in standard. Next, we've got Elfish Refueler for 2 and a green mana. You get an Elf Druid, that's a 2/3, and during your turn, as long as you haven't activated an exhaust ability this turn, you may activate exhaust abilities as though they hadn't been activated. And her exhaust cost is 1 and a green mana, and you get to put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. So Elvish Refueler is a important card if there is going to be an exhaust deck, because you get to use those abilities twice, because exhaust as an ability, you can only use it once normally, and Elvish Refueler gives you the ability to use it a couple of times. And if you blink this, or blink those, then you can reuse them. So I think this is a card that if we do see a deck that's built around the exhaust mechanic, then Elvish Refueler, it makes a lot of sense in that deck. Next, we've got Venom Sac Lagas for 1 and a green mana. You get a Lizard Mount. That's a 2/1 with Death Touch. And whenever this creature attacks while saddled, it gets +0/+3 until end of turn, and it saddles for 2. So, definitely a good creature in limited, and potentially has some standard playability if we do see a mount deck form that wants small creatures in it. Because having a 2/4 for 2, is a good rate for this with that Death Touch ability on it. And we've seen cards similar to this that cost more mana, really become a problem for some decks in standard to get through because of the Death Touch ability. So I could see this as a card that could have that same problem, or give people the same problem that those cards are giving it. Next, we've got Apocalypse Runner for 2, a black and a red mana. You get an artifact vehicle. That's a 6/5. And you can tap it, and target creature you control with power 2 or less gains lifelink until end of turn and can't be blocked, and it crews for 3. So again, it's one of those, if we have a vehicle deck in black and red, it might see play. But outside of that, I don't think it sees much play outside of limited. Next, we've got Boosted Sloop for 1, a blue and a red mana. You get an artifact vehicle. That's a 3/3 with menace. And whenever you attack, draw a card and then discard a card, and it crews for 1. So I can see Boosted Sloop, as a card that does see play in standard. That ability to draw and discard is very important, particularly in a deck where we're trying to get specific cards into the graveyard, and this is an easy way to do that. Next, we've got Cloudspire Sky Cycle for 2, a red and a white mana, you get an artifact vehicle. That's a 2/3 with flying. And when this vehicle enters the battlefield, distribute 2+1/+1 counters among 1 or 2 other target vehicles and or creatures you control, and it crews for 1. So nice ability on it, but we simply have better stuff for 4 mana in standard and red and white that doesn't even see play. So I can't see this seeing play because of that. Next, we've got Guide Light Pathmaker for 4, a white and a blue mana. You get an artifact vehicle. That's a 6/5 with vigilance. And when this vehicle enters the battlefield, you may search your library for an artifact card and reveal it. Put it onto the battlefield if its mana value is 2 or less. Otherwise, put it in your hand, then shuffle. And it crews for 2. So again, if we do end up with a Azorius artifact deck, this might work in that deck because it does have a high cost of 6 mana, but you also get to rummage through your deck and find an artifact card that you want. So whatever key piece you need, this is a way to get that. So if we have a need for that in standard, then this card would meet that need of being able to go through your deck and pull out whatever artifact card you want. Next, we've got Logran, Soul of Alakria for a green and a white mana. You get a legendary creature that's a beast mount. It's a 1/1 with flying. And whenever Logran attacks while saddled, put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 target mounts and or vehicles. And it saddles for 1. So I think this is actually so far one of the best mounts that we have because it has a low cost to saddle it, but also it has that ability to grow as you play the game. And because of that, I think this is something that has a good chance of seeing standard play if we have a deck that is going to use mounts or indoor vehicles in these colors. Next, we've got the Rangers Ether Hive for 1, a green and a blue mana. You get an artifact vehicle with vigilance. That's a 3/5. And whenever you activate an exhaust ability, create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying, and it crews for 1. So I really like this one. For 3 mana, you get an artifact that you won't have much difficulty crewing. But I really do like the ability to create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token anytime you use an exhaust ability. So obviously this is going to go into a deck that has a lot of cards that are going to use that ability. So I think a very strong card in limited. And if we do end up with an exhaust deck in standard, then I think this is a good card to add to that. Next, we've got Rocketeer Boost Buggy for a red and a green mana. You get an artifact vehicle. That's a 3/2. And whenever this vehicle attacks, create a treasure token. It also has exhaust for 3 mana. This vehicle becomes an artifact creature and put a +1/+1 counter on it, and it crews for 1. So I think this is a vehicle that, again, it's such a low cost that we could see this in standard. And the exhaust ability of 3 mana to make it a creature and give it a +1/+1 counter, I think is enough to make this playable in standard. Again, the question is there a deck that's going to want this kind of card? And the fact that it does create a treasure token every time you attack with it, I think might be enough to encourage players to try it. All right, and that brings us to our last card of the day, and that's Starting Column for 3 mana. You get an artifact with Start Your Engine, and it adds 1 mana of any color. And once you reach max speed, you can sacrifice this artifact to draw 2 cards, and then discard a card. Probably is not going to see much play outside of limited, but a good limited card. All right, those are our commons and uncommons from day 1 of Aetherdrift previews. We'll be back tomorrow with more preview videos from Aetherdrift. And I put links here to my video on Mythic Rares and also rares from the set from day 1. So I hope you enjoy those, and thanks for staying to the end of the video. And remember to like and subscribe to get further content like this throughout Aetherdrift spoiler season and beyond. Thanks. I'll see you next time.